Judge Sinclair smirks as the black woman stands alone in court. Then she summons FBI authorities to expose him. A single mother stands in front of a cold marble bench, her heart pounding in her chest like a sledgehammer. A smug, silver-haired judge leans forward, lips twisting into a condescending smirk that sends a chill through the packed courtroom. Whispers ripple across the room, but Elena Rivers, despite her trembling knees, stands her ground. She's been wronged, ridiculed, and set up. The judge's racist sneer is as chilling as it is predictable, yet Elena refuses to falter. Little does she know, a secret investigation by the highest authorities of the FBI is already underway, and when the truth comes to light, it will shatter everything. Elena Rivers woke that morning with a sense of dread clawing at her insides. She tried her best to shake it off. After all, she had her 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, to think about. The little girl needed her mother strong and focused. Yet Elena couldn't help but replay in her mind all the bizarre injustices she'd already faced. Her landlord's abrupt notice to vacate, her employer claiming she was caught stealing, and now, unbelievably, a summons to appear in court on charges she never even knew existed until 2 weeks ago. The summons arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, dropped into her mailbox like an afterthought. When she'd opened it, her heart nearly stopped. The accusations, fraud, misconduct, and breach of contract. Elena had never stolen so much as a penny in her life, but there it was on official letterhead from the Superior Court of Crestview County. She felt as if her world was unraveling thread by thread. As she dressed for court in the only conservative outfit she had, a knee-length gray skirt and a faded black blazer, she whispered a prayer. She was no stranger to adversity. From the day she was born, the world seemed eager to show her just how uphill her battles would be. Growing up in a rundown Chicago suburb, Elena learned to fight for every opportunity. She studied hard, earned scholarships, and eventually landed a respectable job at a local bank. Her biggest pride was showing Sophie that with perseverance and faith, you could rise above the shackles of your environment. But now, Elena felt the constraints of an invisible system tightening around her. Her mother's voice echoed in her ears, reminding her that justice sometimes wore a twisted grin, but Elena refused to believe that all was lost. She gathered her legal documents, meticulously arranged them in a black folder, and headed out into a crisp morning. She had no lawyer, couldn't afford one at the moment, but she had the truth. When Elena entered the courthouse, she felt eyes on her. It wasn't her imagination. She noticed a few curious glances, a few pitying stares. Perhaps they could see the nerves dancing on her face, or maybe it was the color of her skin in a place that reeked of archaic decorum. The wide halls were lined with scuffed floors and flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of old coffee and fear. She made her way into the assigned courtroom and slipped into a bench, the chaotic buzz of voices bouncing off the high ceilings. Prosecutors, defendants, attorneys, security guards, they all blended into a swirl of anxious energy. Elena tried to steady her breathing, tried to remain calm. She clutched her folder close to her chest. Moments before the judge took the bench, Elena glanced around. She was alone. No friend or family member had been able to take off work to support her. She cursed her pride for not wanting to beg for help, but more than anything, she wished Sophie wasn't at home with a neighbor, worried sick about what was happening to her mommy. Then the door swung open, and all rose for Judge Arthur Sinclair. He was a tall, slender man with slick silver hair that swept back from his temples. His robe hung on him like a cloak of authority, yet what Elena noticed most was his expression. The moment his gaze landed on her, a barely contained smirk curled on his lips. Seated, the bailiff commanded, and everyone obeyed in a hushed shuffle. The murmurs quieted to a hush. Elena's heart hammered so hard she feared everyone could hear it. She reminded herself, "I did nothing wrong. I am innocent." But as she locked eyes with Judge Sinclair, Elena felt a surge of dread. There was something in his stare, an air of superiority, an undercurrent of contempt that struck her like a blow to the stomach. She wondered if he'd made his judgment already without hearing a single word. In the hush of the courtroom, Elena silently vowed to fight. She didn't know how, with no lawyer and no funds, but she would not bow to injustice. Little did she know that her struggle in that courtroom was but the tip of the iceberg. Forces far larger, far darker, were at work, and unbeknownst to her, an FBI investigation had already begun, the seeds of truth already planted, seeds that would eventually topple the smirking judge from his lofty perch. The bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber. Case number 4287, The People vs. Elena Rivers. Charges: fraud, embezzlement, and breach of contract. Whispered gasps rippled through the courtroom gallery. Elena felt each syllable like a hammer blow to her chest. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening, tears threatening to spill. Judge Sinclair cleared his throat. "Miss Rivers, how do you plead?" Elena stood, voice trembling. "Not guilty, Your Honor." A faint flicker of amusement danced across the judge's face. "Very well. Let's proceed with the preliminary hearing." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Marcus Cole, stepped forward. Elena recognized him from local news broadcasts. He had a reputation for his aggressive style. He was known to be unstoppable in the pursuit of convictions, no matter how flimsy the evidence. He began reading from a file. According to the allegations, Elena had intentionally manipulated numbers in her role at Crestview Bank, funneling money out of client accounts over a period of 6 months. The total sum mentioned was staggering, over $85,000. Elena's stomach lurched. This was impossible. She had never taken a cent, nor had she ever seen these suspicious accounts she was now accused of tampering with. Furthermore, the prosecutor's voice thundered. Miss Rivers entered into a contractual agreement with the bank that she would uphold the highest standards of integrity. In violating that trust, she also breaches her contract. Elena sat down hard. Her mind reeled. Who orchestrated this? Why? Judge Sinclair shot her a glance, so cold Elena practically felt it pierce her. Miss Rivers, you may speak in your defense, but you do not have representation. Is that correct? She nodded, swallowing. Yes, Your Honor. I can't afford an attorney right now. Well, Sinclair said, lips turning up in that same arrogant smirk. You do realize this is a serious matter, correct? Yes, Your Honor, I do. He gestured dismissively at the sheaf of papers Elena clutched. What evidence do you have to refute the prosecution's claim? Elena's hands shook as she held up her folder. I have my employment records, performance reports, and references. I also have evidence that on the dates in question, I was working on different assignments. None of the suspicious transactions ever crossed my desk. I never had clearance or access to the accounts in question. The judge leaned back, tapping a pen against the bench. Is that all? She felt her throat constrict. For now, yes, Your Honor. Cole slid Elena a condescending glance. Your Honor, I would like to request that Miss Rivers be taken into custody or at least be placed under strict supervision. We have reason to believe she might be a flight risk. Elena gasped audibly. The notion was absurd. She had a daughter, a home, well, the remains of a home. She had no means or desire to flee. Yet from the corner of her eye, she saw the judge's lips twist again, almost as though he was enjoying this. All right, Sinclair said, peering down at Elena. Bail is set at $50,000. A hush fell. She had no means to pay even a fraction of that amount. She'd be forced into a bail bonds arrangement if she wanted to taste freedom before trial, if that was even feasible with her meager finances. Elena felt panic rising. The entire situation reeked of something hidden. Why was the bail so high for a nonviolent offense? Why were these fraudulent charges pinned on her so suddenly? The hearing ended, and Elena was left with an anxious swirl in her gut. As the court officers escorted her toward a holding area to process her for an overnight stay until bail could be arranged, she heard Cole chuckling with Judge Sinclair, the quiet hum of their voices coated in an undercurrent of contempt. She glanced back at them, eyes stinging. Sinclair's smirk was the last thing she saw before a guard gently nudged her forward. In the corridor, Elena's head swam with questions, fear, and anger. She tried to recall every day she'd spent at Crestview Bank. She'd been a model employee, arriving early, staying late, no disciplinary actions. She was hardly living lavishly. Her battered old Honda was testament enough to her financial status. So who was behind this malicious accusation? She was taken to a small, pale room with flickering fluorescent lights. There, an officer began the intake process. Fingerprints, mugshot, the works. Elena's stomach dropped further with each step, the indignity of it, like she was a criminal. Still, she forced herself to hold her head high for Sophie's sake. This wasn't over. While she waited, she overheard 2 guards chatting by the door. One guard casually mentioned something about Judge Sinclair and his after-hours parties. followed by a sardonic laugh from the other. Elena tried not to listen, but her ears perked up at the mention of the judge's name. Even so, the guards offered no detail, slipping into hushed tones. In that moment, Elena vowed to uncover the truth, whatever it took. If Judge Sinclair was crooked, if the prosecutor was in on it, or if someone at the bank had set her up, she would not rest until she exposed them. She only hoped she could muster the resources and courage to face down men with far more power than she. Unknown to Elena, her determination was about to collide with a powerful ally somewhere behind the scenes. Night fell as Elena was processed into the Crestview County Detention Center. She was given a stiff, narrow cot and a thin blanket, and the fluorescent overhead lights buzzed incessantly, refusing her a peaceful sleep. Her heart ached. She worried for Sophie, worried that her daughter might wake up crying in the middle of the night, missing her mother's comforting presence. Elena choked back tears and reminded herself that this was temporary. It had to be. Across town, in a well-appointed office on the top floor of the Crestview Bank building, a man named Bernard Stanton sat behind a large mahogany desk. He was the regional director of the bank and a man Elena had rarely encountered during her tenure there. He tapped a fountain pen against a stack of documents in agitation. The clock on the wall read close to midnight, yet his brow was still furrowed with concentration. In front of him sat Daniel Atherton, one of the bank's board members. Daniel was flipping through a folder with Elena's photograph paper clipped to the inside. The allegations against her were spelled out in black and white, just as the prosecutor had described. "You're certain this is watertight?" Daniel asked, voice tinged with impatience. Bernard sucked in a breath. "As long as the judge and Cole do their jobs, Elena Rivers will take the fall. She doesn't have the means to fight this, and if she does try, well, we have our ways." Daniel eyed him skeptically. "I don't like it. The timeline looks messy, and Elena doesn't strike me as the type. Her performance reviews were stellar. She's never shown any sign of misconduct." Bernard shrugged. "That's precisely why she's the perfect scapegoat. People will be shocked, but that shock will fade once a conviction is secured. Meanwhile, we'll ensure that no one traces the missing funds back to where they really went." A silence fell. Bernard's gaze flickered to a corner of his office where a security camera blinked a little red light. Better to keep details vague, he reminded himself. Daniel closed the folder. "Fine, I'll trust your judgment. But if anything backfires, the blame is on you. I won't let the bank's reputation burn because of a single employee you decided to frame." Frame. The word was so blatant. Bernard merely nodded. If Elena was too naive to see it coming, that was her problem. Later that night, as Elena dozed fitfully in her cell, a slender, bespectacled man paced the living room of his modest apartment, a laptop open on the table. His name was Special Agent Lee Kwan, stationed at the FBI's Chicago field office. Though not a high-ranking official, he'd been working on a hunch: unexplained funds siphoned off from local corporations. A whistleblower inside Crestview Bank had tipped him off about suspicious financial movement. On a hunch, Kwan had begun to dig, and Elena Rivers' case popped up with bright, flashing alarms. The details were far too convenient. A model employee suddenly accused of embezzlement. The entire narrative smelled of corruption. Clicking through encrypted files, Kwan noted Elena's impeccable record. A single mother, relatively new to the city, known for her honesty and diligence, no prior brushes with the law. Yet here she was, charged with orchestrating a complex financial crime. Kwan's gut told him Elena was a pawn in a larger scheme. A message pinged on Kwan's phone. "Heard Elena Rivers was processed tonight. No bail posted yet. She's rotting in a cell." The message came from an anonymous contact he'd made within the courthouse. The swirl of suspicion around Judge Sinclair's name only fueled Kwan's concerns. Sinclair had a track record of questionable rulings when the defendants were people of color, particularly those with limited means. Kwan scribbled notes in a small, leather-bound journal. Elena Rivers equals suspect or scapegoat. Potential collusion. Crestview Bank leadership. Judge Sinclair. ADA Cole. Keep investigating. Unknown to Elena, small gears were already turning in her favor. The FBI might not be a monolith that swoops in at the drop of a hat, but individual agents with integrity still existed. They saw patterns others would dismiss. They cared enough to question the status quo. Soon, Kwan would bring his findings to his superiors. The name Elena Rivers would land on the desk of someone with power, someone who could tip the scales of justice. Meanwhile, Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her dim cell. She wondered how she'd gotten here, so alone and cornered. She thought about Sophie's bright smile, about the child's sweet, unshakable faith in her mother. That single memory gave Elena the courage to endure. She prayed quietly, the words spilling out in the stillness of the detention center. I will prove my innocence. But Elena had no idea how deep the corruption went, nor how dangerous her enemies truly were. Judge Sinclair, with his smarmy grin and deep ties in Crestview's old boy network, was only the tip of the spear. If Elena intended to bring him down, she would be tangling with a system designed to protect men like him. Yet destiny was already weaving threads beyond Elena's comprehension. In a few days, the first glimmer of hope would come from an unexpected source, and the ripple effect of that hope would reach all the way to the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., the FBI's headquarters. Early the next morning, Elena found herself escorted back into the courtroom. She looked disheveled, exhausted, yet she tried to stand tall. She'd managed to contact a bail bondsman overnight who agreed to post her bail in exchange for a loan Elena would be paying off for years. But Elena would do anything to be back with her daughter. The judge, again presiding with his cold, smug demeanor, asked if Elena intended to secure an attorney. She nodded, but with her finances in disarray, she wasn't sure if she could afford decent counsel. Judge Sinclair insisted the trial date be set within 3 weeks, an unusually fast turnaround for a fraud case. The speed only intensified Elena's anxiety. Usually, such cases took months to prepare, but Elena suspected Sinclair wanted to rush through to ensure she had minimal time to mount a credible defense. As she stepped out of the courtroom, Elena was approached by a petite woman with curly brown hair and striking green eyes. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, carrying a stack of papers in her arms. Miss Rivers? Wait. Elena turned, confused. Yes. The woman extended a business card. Natalie Morris, investigative journalist, Crestview Times. I've been following your case, she said softly, glancing around to ensure no one overheard. Something about it doesn't add up. Would you be willing to talk to me? Elena hesitated, glancing at the card. She was wary of the press, concerned about sensational headlines. But Morris's voice had a sincerity that tugged at Elena's instincts. And Elena did need help. Someone, anyone, who could shine a light on the truth. Yes, I'll talk to you. Thank you, Natalie said, relief evident in her tone. I'll message you to set up a time. You're not alone in this, Elena. Tears stung Elena's eyes. She nodded, pressing her lips together before walking away. By late afternoon, Elena had returned to her modest apartment. She found her daughter coloring quietly at the kitchen table under the neighbor's watchful eye. The moment Sophie saw Elena, she dashed across the room, small arms flinging around her mother's waist. Elena knelt, hugging her child close, inhaling the sweet scent of bubblegum shampoo. For an instant, the burden lifted. She was home, at least. How was your night, Mommy? Sophie asked, her wide eyes blinking in curiosity. Elena gently smoothed back the child's braids. It was fine, she said. I missed you so much. For a few precious moments, she allowed herself to forget the looming darkness of the case. Yet practical matters soon demanded her attention. She had no job now, no income. Legal fees loomed, as did the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence if she failed to clear her name. That evening, Elena and Natalie Morris met in a quiet corner of a local cafe. Elena recounted everything. The suspicious charges, the judge's smirk, the abnormally high bail, and how her entire world flipped upside down. Natalie listened intently, taking notes. When Elena finished, the journalist leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed. I've heard rumors about Judge Sinclair, she said. He's known to take hush-hush campaign contributions from wealthy donors. Usually it's real estate moguls, bankers, you name it. Then he repays them with favorable rulings. But I've never been able to nail him with hard proof. He's well connected, and any time I got close, my sources dried up. Elena's pulse quickened. So you think the bank might be behind this? Some sort of arrangement with Sinclair? Natalie tapped her pen on her notepad. If the bank's leadership needed someone to blame for missing funds, someone to distract from their own wrongdoing, Elena, you'd be the perfect scapegoat, a low-level employee, an easy target. And if Sinclair is in their pocket, he'll ensure that your side of the story is suppressed. Elena's throat tightened. That can't be legal. Can we prove it? That's what I intend to find out. If I find hard evidence, I'll publish it. The public deserves to know. They exchanged contact information. Elena felt a flicker of hope. She recognized the danger. If powerful men were truly orchestrating this, they wouldn't hesitate to intimidate or silence a journalist. But Elena couldn't afford to back down. Sophie's future and Elena's freedom hung in the balance. Unbeknownst to them, across the street, a hooded figure lingered in the shadows, snapping photos of their meeting with a long lens camera. As Elena and Natalie parted ways, the figure pulled out a phone and fired off a text message, attaching a few of the photos. Subject: meeting with local reporter. Need instructions. The following morning, Elena received a cryptic email from someone claiming to be a friend in the justice system. The message read, "I believe you're innocent. Don't trust anyone in that courthouse. Keep track of every conversation, every interaction. The truth will come out if you persevere." Elena read it twice, heart pounding with mingled dread and hope. Who was this mysterious ally? Was it a trap? She had no way of knowing. Meanwhile, at the FBI's Chicago field office, Special Agent Lee Kwan pored over financial statements from Crestview Bank and cross-referenced them with Elena's case. He traced the movement of $85,000 in small increments. The transfers led to shell accounts, then hopped across multiple platforms. But one name, Bernard Stanton, appeared in the background of these transactions. Kwan saw enough red flags to proceed. He typed up a formal request to escalate this matter to the next level, explaining in detail how Elena Rivers was likely being framed as part of a broader scheme. By day's end, Kwan's boss, Supervisory Special Agent Evelyn Hayes, called him in. "You've got my attention, Kwan," she said, holding up his request. "This is big. Embezzlement, a crooked judge, possibly a high-level cover-up. Are you sure of your evidence?" Kwan nodded, swallowing. "I'm building a strong case, but I need more time, more resources. Elena Rivers' trial is in 3 weeks. If we don't act swiftly, an innocent woman could go to prison, and we might lose the chance to expose a major corruption network." Hayes pursed her lips, eyeing the data. "All right, I'll authorize a deeper investigation. Keep me updated, and be careful. If Sinclair is as powerful as you say, he won't like the FBI snooping around." Kwan thanked her and left, a mixture of relief and apprehension swirling in his gut. He suspected the noose was tightening around Elena. She had no idea the depth of the forces aligned against her. But with the FBI now on high alert, Elena had an invisible shield forming around her, one that might just save her life and blow this case wide open. For the next week, Elena threw herself into preparing her defense. She borrowed law textbooks from the public library, pored over every detail of her bank's code of conduct, and scribbled notes about her daily tasks at Crestview Bank. She mapped out her timelines, aligning them with the fraudulent transactions whenever possible. She sent details to Natalie Morris, who quietly hunted for leads in the bank's labyrinth of records. The daily grind wore Elena down. At times, she felt a wave of despair. She was fighting against powerful men with nearly limitless resources. Yet through it all, thoughts of Sophie spurred her on. At night, after tucking her daughter in bed, Elena reread that cryptic email from the unknown friend in the justice system. It was strangely comforting to believe someone out there believed her. One afternoon, Elena was stacking her documents on the kitchen table when the doorbell rang. Cautious, she peered through the peephole. A slender Asian man in a neat suit stood in the hallway, glancing at a folder in his hand. Elena's heart pounded. She didn't recognize him, but she recalled the day she'd been arrested. Did an officer wear a similar suit? She wasn't sure. She opened the door a crack. "Yes, Miss Rivers," the man asked gently. "My name is Lee Kwan. I'm with the FBI." He held up an identification badge. Elena's eyes widened. Part of her was terrified. Was she about to be rearrested? But she also recalled the mention of the FBI in that cryptic email. Tentatively, she let him inside. Kwan surveyed the humble living room, noting Sophie's toys strewn about. He smiled politely and asked if she was alone. Elena nodded. Sophie was at school, for which Elena was grateful. She didn't want to alarm her child. "I'm here because your case has come across my desk," he said, settling onto the couch. "I believe there's significant evidence to indicate you're being framed." Elena's breath caught. "Framed? You can help me." "That's our hope," Kwan said carefully. "I can't promise immediate results, but my team and I are looking into Judge Sinclair and various associates at Crestview Bank. We think you were made the scapegoat for a large-scale embezzlement scheme. Tears of relief prickled Elena's eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Nobody seems to believe me, and I can't afford a lawyer good enough to go up against them. Quan nodded sympathetically. I understand. Unfortunately, you still have to appear in court. But if we gather enough evidence on our end, we can blow this case wide open. That might lead to a dismissal of charges and criminal indictments against those involved. Elena's heart soared, but she tempered her hope. What do you need from me? Any documentation you have. Emails, memos, transaction records, personal notes, anything that might show your innocence or hint at wrongdoing from others. Also, be careful. If these people sense a federal investigation, they might try to intimidate or bribe you, or worse. Elena handed over a thick folder, explaining every piece of paperwork in it. Quan listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. Your trial is in 2 weeks, he said at last. We're moving as quickly as we can, but the FBI's wheels can turn slowly. I'll do my best to expedite everything. She nodded. Thank you, Agent Quan. I can't express how grateful I am. He gave her a kind smile. Hang in there. We'll be in touch. After Quan left, Elena sank onto the couch, a wave of cautious optimism washing over her. Could it be that justice would prevail after all? She felt a renewed determination, not just to defend herself, but to see the real criminals unmasked. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Judge Sinclair met with Bernard Stanton in a private room at the local country club. The judge sipped scotch while Bernard paced in agitation. We have a problem, Bernard said gruffly. Rumor has it that the FBI is sniffing around, some agent named Quan. Our inside source at the courthouse tipped us off. Sinclair set his glass down, jaw tensing. If the FBI is involved, we need to accelerate our plan. Elena's trial date is set. I'll make sure the proceedings are swift and the jury stacked. She won't have time to gather any exculpatory evidence. Bernard exhaled. That's not enough. I can't have the FBI poking around the bank's records. If they connect the missing funds to me, I'm finished. Sinclair's eyes flashed with disdain. Let me handle that. Keep your people quiet and your documents well hidden. We'll bury Elena in so much legal filth she won't see daylight. And by the time the feds catch wind, the matter will be closed. Their conversation turned to hush-hush specifics that would seal Elena's fate if they succeeded. They parted with a firm handshake, each man aware that the stakes had just risen exponentially. Far away in Washington, D.C., at the J. Edgar Hoover Building, Supervisory Special Agent Evelyn Hayes skimmed Lee Kwan's latest report. The evidence pointed not just to Judge Sinclair, but to a network of local officials involved in corruption spanning years. The case would be complex, requiring airtight surveillance and cautious infiltration. She typed a quick email to Quan. Proceed with caution. We've got you covered. Let's shine a light on Crestview. The wheels of justice, slow as they often are, were turning. Elena Rivers, once alone and overwhelmed, now had allies beyond her imagination. And though the forces against her were formidable, a new chapter of her life was unfolding. One where the powerful manipulations of men like Judge Sinclair and Bernard Stanton would come face to face with the truth and the unstoppable momentum of karma. Tension gripped Crestview County in the days leading up to Elena's trial. Whispers of FBI involvement spread like wildfire among courthouse staff, prosecutors, and law enforcement. Judge Sinclair, for his part, seemed to carry on with business as usual, though sharp-eyed observers noted a tautness in his features, an undercurrent of worry behind the well-practiced arrogance. At her apartment, Elena made dinner for Sophie, who chattered about school. The child was blissfully unaware of the impending trial. Elena was grateful for her daughter's innocence. It shielded Sophie from the storm raging just beyond their door. In the midst of stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce, Elena's phone buzzed. She snatched it off the counter to see an unknown number. With a cautious heartbeat, she answered. Miss Rivers, came the low voice. Natalie Moore is here. Natalie, hi. Wanted to give you a heads up. I managed to find a junior employee at Crestview Bank who claims that Bernard Stanton personally altered internal logs to fabricate your involvement in the missing funds. Elena's eyes widened. That's the smoking gun, right? It could be, Natalie cautioned, but the employee is scared, terrified actually. They fear for their job, maybe even their safety. I'm trying to convince them to go on record, but it's not easy. Elena exhaled slowly. Tell them they can speak to the FBI. Agent Lee Kwan is investigating. If they can show proof, that might protect them. I already suggested that. They want to remain anonymous, though. They said something about Judge Sinclair destroying people who stand in his way. A chill crept up Elena's spine. She knew the fear well. Keep me posted, okay? Absolutely. Stay safe. They hung up. Elena stared at the phone, heart pounding. Someone at the bank was close to revealing the truth. If that happened, Elena's trial might become a lightning rod for all the hidden corruption. She prayed that the frightened employee would come forward. Later that night, Elena tiptoed into Sophie's room. The girl was fast asleep, arms cradling a well-loved teddy bear. Elena felt an overwhelming protectiveness. If the worst happened and Elena ended up behind bars, what would become of Sophie? That thought alone was enough to reignite Elena's resolve. She stepped away quietly, determined to do whatever it took to remain free and care for her daughter. The next morning, Elena was greeted by an unexpected visitor, an older woman with kind brown eyes, wearing a crisp navy suit. She introduced herself as attorney Miriam Foster from a local legal aid organization. Miss Rivers, we heard about your case. One of our donors insists we take it on pro bono. Elena blinked in disbelief. Why would they do that? I'm grateful, but Miriam offered a warm smile. Sometimes people want to do the right thing, even anonymously. If you'll allow me, I'd like to represent you at trial. Elena felt an avalanche of relief. Yes, of course. Thank you, Miss Foster. Thank you. They spent the next several hours huddled at Elena's kitchen table, going over every piece of evidence Elena had. Miriam asked pointed questions, meticulously charting out a defense strategy. Elena marveled at how thorough the woman was, how systematically she poked holes in the prosecution's case. For the first time, Elena felt an actual fighting chance in the courtroom. That same day, far across town, Bernard Stanton stormed into a small back office of the Crestview Bank, slamming the door behind him. He confronted a trembling clerk named Thomas, the junior employee who had confided in Natalie Morris. I know you've been talking to a reporter, Bernard growled, pressing a finger into the clerk's chest. You think you're some kind of hero? Let me tell you something. One word from me, and your career is over. Understand? Thomas stammered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. I don't know what you're talking about. Bernard sneered. Don't play innocent. Keep your mouth shut about the logs. It's that simple. Unless you want me to make an example out of you. With that, Bernard stormed out, leaving Thomas shaking. The clerk fumbled for his phone, a swirl of guilt and fear tearing at him. He knew Elena was innocent. He had proof. And yet, the risk of going public weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, FBI agent Lee Kwan met with Supervisory Special Agent Evelyn Hayes, detailing the progress. So Elena Rivers has a new lawyer, courtesy of an anonymous donor. Interesting, Hayes mused, scanning a file. Did you have anything to do with that? Kwan shook his head. Not me. Could be someone local who sees the injustice. Hayes tapped her pen against the desk. We've collected enough circumstantial evidence to justify a deeper probe into Bernard Stanton. We also have unconfirmed reports that Judge Sinclair has ties to a hush fund financed by bank executives. We need something concrete. A ledger, bank statements, verified witness testimony. Kwan nodded. I'm on it. The trial starts in a week. If Elena is forced to face that judge without more evidence in her favor, the outcome could be disastrous. But if we break this wide open beforehand, Sinclair won't have the chance to finalize a conviction. Hayes sighed. Time is our enemy, Kwan. Get what we need. I'll do my best to push it up the chain. A sense of urgency coursed through Kwan. Elena's future hung in the balance. Not just Elena's, but potentially that of others who might have been framed before her. Judge Sinclair's bigoted bias and unscrupulous connections were rumored to have destroyed more than one life in the past. This was the FBI's chance to end his reign of corruption once and for all. As the sun set, Elena found herself at her kitchen table again, poring over documents with Miriam Foster. They practiced Elena's testimony, running through questions the prosecutor might throw at her. Miriam insisted on Elena maintaining composure, reminding her that the jury's perception would matter as much as the facts. At one point, Elena asked quietly, "Do you believe me, Miriam? That I'm innocent." Miriam sat down her pen, meeting Elena's gaze. "Yes, Elena, I do. If I didn't, I wouldn't be here. You have a strong case, and I will do everything in my power to prove it." Elena's chest tightened with gratitude. She offered a small smile. "Thank you. I don't think I can do this alone." Miriam placed a hand on Elena's forearm. You're not alone anymore. We'll see this through. With that resolve, Elena pressed forward. The forces of corruption were formidable, but she now had an attorney, a journalist digging for truth, and an FBI agent working relentlessly behind the scenes. The day of reckoning was fast approaching, and Elena intended to greet it head-on. She couldn't know every twist fate had in store, but she'd soon discover just how much power the truth could wield when the right people stand up to defend it. At last, the trial day dawned. Elena stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the wrinkles from her best blouse. Her hair was pulled back neatly, hands trembling from the weight of anticipation. This is it, she thought, my chance to clear my name. Miriam Foster arrived to pick Elena up, ushering her into a car. Together they rode in silence to the courthouse, Elena steeling herself for battle. She clutched a small folder of notes. Not that she had any illusions about her power in the courtroom. Everything depended on Miriam's skill and the hope that evidence from the FBI or the journalist might come through in time. Inside the ornate courtroom, Elena took a seat at the defense table. The prosecutor, Marcus Cole, regarded her with predatory confidence. Judge Sinclair presided with his usual air of cold detachment, yet Elena caught a flicker of unease behind the judge's eyes. The case began with opening statements. Cole painted Elena as a calculating employee who exploited her position at the bank to siphon funds, betraying trust and contractual obligations. He presented it as an open and shut affair, flaunting partial transaction logs. Elena felt her pulse race as the evidence was displayed. It was all carefully curated to point in her direction, her login credentials, her proximity to the accounts. She realized how thoroughly she'd been set up. Miriam responded with calm determination. She introduced Elena's impeccable work history, testimonials from co-workers who trusted her implicitly, and the lack of any suspicious behavior or sudden financial windfall on Elena's part. Miss Rivers' bank account, Miriam pointed out, is perpetually near zero. She drives an old car. She has no assets that correlate to an $85,000 theft. This entire scenario defies logic. Judge Sinclair narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. Over the next few days, the prosecution called in bank representatives who repeated the same scripted narrative. Elena had access. Elena had opportunity. Elena must have done it. Miriam cross-examined them fiercely, pointing out inconsistencies, but the judge sustained many objections from the prosecution, limiting Miriam's lines of questioning. Elena noticed Sinclair's smirk appearing whenever he overruled. The jury seemed divided. Some looked sympathetic, others looked swayed by Cole's confident performance. On the third day, a surprise witness took the stand. Thomas, the junior clerk from Crestview Bank. Elena's heart soared at the sight of him. She remembered Natalie's calls about him. Was he about to finally tell the truth? Thomas seemed visibly nervous, sweat beading at his temple. He testified that he'd been the one to note the discrepancies in the bank's logs. According to him, Elena's login credentials were used during her lunch breaks, times Elena was known to be away from her desk. Miriam jumped on that detail. So, Mr. Thomas, you're saying Elena Rivers was never physically at her computer during these suspicious transactions? Miriam asked. Yes, he stammered. Yes, that's correct. But her credentials were used. That could mean she gave her password to someone else, or maybe maybe she did it remotely. Miriam pressed him. Did you ever witness Elena step away from her computer for extended periods, or see anything unusual about her workstation? Thomas cast a quick glance at Bernard Stanton, who sat in the gallery. Then he swallowed. I did see a manager, Bernard Stanton, at her desk once, but I'm not sure if that's relevant. An excited murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elena's heart thundered. This was exactly what she needed. Could you elaborate? Miriam asked. But before Thomas could answer, the prosecutor objected. Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant and speculative. Judge Sinclair banged his gavel. Sustained. Move on, Miss Foster. Elena's stomach sank. Sinclair was blocking the crucial link that might have exposed Stanton's direct involvement. Thomas slumped off the stand, looking both relieved and guilty. Elena realized how deeply intimidation ran. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, Elena caught up with Thomas near the steps. Thank you for telling even that much, she said quietly. I know it took courage. He avoided her gaze. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. Stanton threatened me. I have a family, a sick mother. I just can't lose my job. Elena didn't know whether to console him or resent him. Still, she mustered a gentle tone. I understand. I appreciate your honesty. The tension inside Elena coiled tighter as the trial neared its final day. With Thomas's partial testimony suppressed by Sinclair, the outcome looked bleak. Miriam tried to subpoena the bank's internal computer logs, but the judge ruled it irrelevant or unnecessarily time-consuming. Elena felt trapped in a rigged game. Then, on the eve of closing arguments, Elena received a phone call from Agent Kwan. Elena, we've got something, he said, voice alight with excitement. We obtained a warrant to search Bernard Stanton's electronic devices. We found the actual logs. They show Stanton repeatedly logging in under your credentials while you were clocked out. That's the smoking gun. We also uncovered communications between Stanton and Judge Sinclair discussing payoffs. Elena's knees nearly buckled. Are you serious? Kwan continued. We're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. There's a chance we can move in before the trial concludes. Keep your phone on. Tears of relief blurred Elena's vision. At last, the truth was within reach. That night, Elena and Miriam stayed up late, preparing to incorporate this new evidence if the FBI could get it admitted in time. Elena felt a wave of determination. She imagined the look on Judge Sinclair's face when confronted with FBI evidence. The very thought propelled her forward. But Judge Sinclair was no fool. He must have sensed the net closing. That night, he made one final call to Bernard Stanton, telling him to destroy anything incriminating to ensure that Elena's trial ended before the feds could intervene. They agreed on one last push to convict Elena tomorrow. Neither man realized that their phone lines were already tapped. The FBI had it all on record. The storm was about to break. The final day of trial dawned heavy with tension. Elena arrived at the courthouse, bracing for the worst and hoping for the best. A strange hush hung in the air as she stepped into the building. She saw no sign of Bernard Stanton. Judge Sinclair sat at the bench, stone-faced, his smirk replaced by tight-lipped sternness. Prosecutor Cole gave his closing argument, summing up Elena as a cunning criminal. Elena's stomach churned. She prayed Miriam would deliver a rebuttal strong enough to instill doubt in the jury's mind. Miriam stood, her voice resonating with calm conviction. She demolished the notion of Elena having any motive, hammered home the inconsistent timeline, and reminded the jury of Thomas's testimony. Though partial, it still revealed Elena's credentials being used when she was absent. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Miriam concluded, my client is a single mother living paycheck to paycheck. She had neither reason nor opportunity to commit this crime. The true culprit remains hidden, and we have reason to believe Miss Rivers was framed. I urge you to look at the facts, not the assumptions. The jurors seemed engaged, some nodding thoughtfully. The judge gave the usual instructions for deliberation, but Elena noticed a sheen of sweat on Sinclair's forehead. He was anxious. Just as the jury was about to be escorted out for deliberation, an unexpected commotion erupted. The courtroom doors swung open, revealing a group of federal agents led by Lee Kwan. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Elena's heart leaped to her throat. I'm sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, Kwan said, stepping forward. But we have federal warrants for the arrest of Bernard Stanton, as well as a search and seizure order for evidence that pertains to this trial. Judge Sinclair's face blanched. He pounded his gavel with unprecedented force. What is the meaning of this disruption, Agent? You have no authority to barge into my court without prior notice. Kwan held his ground. With all due respect, we do, Your Honor. We have evidence that Miss Rivers was framed by Bernard Stanton, who collaborated with others. And we have reason to believe you, Judge Sinclair, have aided in covering this up. We also have a warrant for your arrest. The entire courtroom exploded into chaos, spectators shrieking, reporters scrambling. Elena's eyes widened in disbelief. She gripped the edge of the table, uncertain whether to laugh or cry. Miriam rested a hand on Elena's shoulder, expression triumphant. Bailiff, Judge Sinclair barked. Remove these men. This is an outrage. I'm the presiding judge here. The bailiff exchanged uncertain glances with the federal agents. Kwan calmly flashed the official warrants. Stand down. Federal jurisdiction supersedes. We have conclusive proof, Your Honor, that you accepted payments in exchange for manipulating court outcomes and forging evidence against Miss Rivers. Our agents are already detaining Bernard Stanton, who attempted to flee the county this morning. Judge Sinclair's eyes darted toward the side exit as though contemplating an escape, but the presence of multiple federal agents quashed that thought. He stood, raging. This is slander. Lies. I've done nothing wrong. My rulings were fair and within the law. Then you can explain that to a federal judge, Kwon replied, stepping forward. For now, you're coming with us. Stunned silence enveloped the courtroom. The jury looked on, mouths agape. Elena's heart hammered. Everything was happening so fast. She watched as two agents guided Judge Sinclair away, the man cursing under his breath, sputtering in indignation. Kwon then approached Elena, voice gentler. Miss Rivers, you are free to go. We have evidence that exonerates you completely. The U.S. Attorney's Office will move to dismiss all charges, effective immediately. Tears flooded Elena's eyes. She clung to Miriam, who blinked back her own emotional wave. Relief poured through Elena, body and soul. A day ago, she had prepared for a last stand, possibly facing years in prison. Now, the unraveling web of corruption had exposed the truth, freeing her from the clutches of injustice. The shocked jurors were dismissed. Reporters scrambled to get Elena's statement, their cameras flashing, but Elena felt too overwhelmed to speak coherently. She wanted to hug her daughter, to savor her freedom. She managed a few words. I'm just grateful justice was served. I'm innocent. Miriam guided Elena away from the swirling media frenzy, ushering her through a side corridor. Outside, Elena inhaled the crisp air, tears slipping down her cheeks as she gazed at the sky. She was free, truly free. A short distance away, Agent Kwon addressed a group of cameras, explaining how an extensive investigation revealed a conspiracy to frame Elena, funneling blame for stolen funds away from Stanton and his network. He also confirmed that Judge Sinclair was implicated, having accepted bribes and obstructed justice. The paparazzi clamored for Elena, but she slipped away, exhausted and emotional. She needed to hold Sophie, to let her daughter's laughter remind her that this nightmare was finally over. Yet Elena also knew her life had changed. The truth had come out, but the trauma would linger. She'd faced the darkest sides of corruption, racism, and betrayal, and she had survived. The headlines would soon blare about the racist judge who smirked at a black woman standing alone in court, only for the highest FBI authorities to blow his cover. Elena hoped her story would inspire others in similar straits, showing that even the most formidable systems of corruption could be toppled by perseverance and the power of truth. In the weeks following the dramatic conclusion of Elena's trial, Crestview County seemed in upheaval. Front-page headlines bore Elena's name alongside the scandal that rocked the local justice system. Judge Arthur Sinclair arrested on corruption charges. Bank executive implicated. In the immediate aftermath, Elena found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. News crews parked outside her apartment, clamoring for interviews. She gently turned most of them down, choosing instead to focus on Sophie and the small kernel of normalcy they could reclaim. I want things to be quiet again, Elena confided to Natalie Morris when the journalist popped by. For Sophie's sake, she's confused seeing all those cameras. Natalie nodded sympathetically. I understand. But Elena, your story is important. It exposes a broken system. If you're willing to talk, I can make sure it's handled respectfully. Elena sighed. Let me think about it. For now, I just want to breathe free air. Behind bars, Judge Sinclair awaited trial. Rumors suggested a lengthy list of charges, from taking bribes to tampering with evidence and civil rights violations. Bernard Stanton, caught trying to skip town, now faced his own mountain of indictments: embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The pair who once exuded unassailable power were reduced to wearing orange jumpsuits, scurrying between court appearances. Karma hit hard. With the evidence provided by Agent Kwon and his FBI colleagues, the case against them was airtight. Former associates distanced themselves in droves, seeking to avoid the same fate. Additional victims, people who had questionable rulings in Sinclair's courtroom, began coming forward, emboldened by Elena's victory. Each new testimony nailed the coffin shut on Sinclair's legacy of corruption and bigotry. Meanwhile, Elena met with attorneys, Miriam by her side, to discuss a potential civil suit against Crestview Bank and the county judicial system. Elena didn't relish going back into legal proceedings, but she needed compensation for the nightmare she endured. More importantly, she wanted institutional change. I'm not doing this for money, Elena told Miriam firmly. I want them to feel consequences so they won't do this to anyone else. Miriam agreed wholeheartedly. We'll ask for a settlement that includes an overhaul of bank oversight and a review of all Sinclair's past rulings. That's the only way to ensure real reform. The first time Elena stepped foot back at Crestview Bank, this time flanked by her attorney, she felt a sting of anxiety. She was there to pick up paperwork for the civil suit, and the hush that fell across the employees was palpable. Eyes darted in every direction, as if they couldn't believe Elena had returned triumphant. One older clerk approached her, tears in her eyes. "Miss Rivers, I'm so sorry for everything you went through. We had no idea." Elena mustered a small, understanding smile. "I appreciate your concern. It's over now." Yet Elena knew the memory would never fully leave her. She thought of the nights in the detention cell, the weight of the accusations, the racist smirk on Sinclair's face. Healing would take time, but at least she was free, and her daughter would see that justice, however delayed, still had a chance in America. At a quiet press conference organized by Agent Kwan and Supervisory Special Agent Hayes, Elena mustered her courage to speak briefly to reporters. She thanked the FBI for their diligence, thanked her attorney, and delivered a heartfelt message for anyone out there facing injustice. Please don't lose hope. Sometimes the system seems stacked against you, but there are good people who will stand by your side when it matters most. Keep fighting. Applause rang out. Behind the scenes, Elena and Sophie worked to rebuild their lives. Elena found a new job at a smaller financial firm, one that admired her courage. The press eventually moved on to the next story, but Elena's case left its mark, spurring official inquiries into how many others had been wronged by Sinclair's judicial misconduct. On the day Elena's civil suit was settled, resulting in a substantial payout and a legally mandated audit of Crestview Bank's internal practices, Elena allowed herself a single moment of pride. She deposited a portion into an education fund for Sophie. Another portion she donated to a civil rights nonprofit advocating for court reform. The cycle of injustice would not continue on her watch, not if she had any say in it. As for Judge Sinclair, Elena learned from news reports that he attempted to cut a deal by flipping on other corrupt officials. The pleas fell on deaf ears. One by one, more people testified against him, painting a portrait of a man who believed his position, his race, and his connections put him above the law. But the law had finally come calling. One bright Sunday morning, Elena and Sophie strolled through the park, hand in hand. Sophie laughed as she ran across the grass, free from the shadow of her mother's tribulations. Elena took a moment to close her eyes, feeling the sun's warmth, the breeze on her cheeks. She was grateful, not for the pain she'd endured, but for the lessons it taught her about perseverance, about community, about the unstoppable force that truth can be. And while Elena would never forget the image of that racist judge smirking at her across the courtroom, she also now had a greater image. The day he was taken away in cuffs, no longer able to harm another life with his corruption and hate. In the end, Elena stood strong, and justice, though battered and bruised, shone through like a beacon of hope. Elena Rivers' journey reminds us that truth can pierce even the darkest clouds of corruption. When all odds seemed stacked against her, when a racist judge, a powerful banker, and a system built to intimidate came crashing down, Elena stood firm in her belief that justice would prevail. She found allies where she least expected, in a dedicated journalist, a compassionate attorney, and a relentless FBI agent determined to uproot the rot in Crestview County. Their combined resolve toppled a twisted empire of bribery and oppression, proving that one voice, amplified by courage, can spark a chain reaction of change.